The colony transport vessel Cradle of Dawn was 3 days into its jump across the Varith system when the drive core screamed and the lights went red. 6-year-old Mira Okafor was sitting in the mess hall, eating a bowl of rice pudding, when the floor tilted sideways and threw her against the wall, and her mother grabbed her by the arm and pulled her upright and said, "Run, baby, run with me now," in a voice that was not calm at all, even though her mother was always calm. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain, and the corridors were full of people running and shouting, and the emergency sirens were so loud that Mira could feel them vibrating inside her chest. And her father was somewhere behind them, yelling something about the port side, but Mira could not hear him over the noise. Her mother carried her into the escape pod bay, where dozens of pods lined the walls like eggs in a nest, and she shoved Mira into pod 17 and strapped her into the seat, forehead, and said, "I am coming right back. I need to get your father. Do not touch anything. I love you so much." And then she turned and ran back into the smoke-filled corridor. The pod door closed by itself. Mira screamed and slammed her small fists against the door, but it would not open. And through the tiny window, she could see the corridor filling with white chemical foam from the fire suppression system. And then there was a sound like thunder made of metal, and the pod launched itself into space, with a force that pressed Mira into her seat so hard she could not breathe. She watched through the viewport as the Cradle of Dawn broke apart in silence, because space has no sound, and pieces of the ship she had lived on for 3 weeks drifted away like leaves falling from a tree. And she did not know if her parents had made it to another pod, or if they were still inside when it cracked open like an egg. The pod's computer spoke in a friendly voice that did not match the situation at all, saying, "Trajectory locked, nearest planetary body detected, initiating emergency descent." And Mira did not understand most of those words, but she understood that she was falling. Varith 4 came up fast through the viewport, a planet covered in thick green and purple jungle that glowed faintly even from orbit, and the pod hit the atmosphere and turned into a ball of fire and shook so hard that Mira's teeth rattled, and she bit her tongue and tasted blood. She did not remember the actual landing, because the impact knocked her unconscious. When she woke up, the pod was on its side, and the emergency lights were blinking orange, and there was a crack in the hull where she could see jungle outside, thick and wet, and glowing with colors she had never seen before. And the air that came through the crack was warm and smelled like rotting fruit mixed with something sweet. Mira unstrapped herself and crawled toward the crack, because the pod was filling with smoke from a fried circuit board, and she knew from school that smoke was bad to breathe. And she squeezed through the gap and fell onto soft ground that was covered in something that looked like moss but felt like wet skin. She stood up and looked around, and the jungle was enormous, with trees taller than any building she had ever seen, and leaves that pulsed with blue and green light, like slow heartbeats. And there were sounds everywhere, clicking and humming, and something far away that might have been a roar, or might have been wind through a canyon. She was alone. She was 6 years old, and she was alone on a planet she had never heard of, and her parents were somewhere up in the black sky that she could not even see through the thick canopy above her. Mira sat down next to the broken pod and pulled her knees to her chest and cried. She cried for a long time, long enough that the shadows shifted and the jungle light changed from blue-green to a gaslight, deeper purple, and she might have cried until she fell asleep, or until something in the jungle found her. Except that a sound from inside the pod made her stop. Something was moving in there. She heard metal scraping, and a low growling sound, and then a creature pushed its way through the crack in the hull, and tumbled onto the moss beside her. And Mira scrambled backward, because she did not know what it was. It was small, maybe the size of a large cat, with coarse silver-black fur, and a flat head, and tiny dark eyes that looked at her with an expression she could not read. And it shook itself the way a dog shakes off water, and bits of foam padding and wire fell from its fur. Mira recognized it then because she had seen it through the window of the xenobiology lab on the ship, when her father had taken her on a tour, and the scientist had said, "That is a honey badger from Earth, specimen TB09, and it is the meanest animal per kilogram that our planet has ever produced. Do not put your fingers near the cage." The honey badger looked at Mira. Mira looked at the honey badger. It walked over to her and sniffed her knee, and then sat down beside her, pressing its warm body against her leg. And it did not run away into the jungle, even though the cage was broken, and it could have gone anywhere. "Hi," Mira whispered. The honey badger made a low chattering sound. "I am going to call you Biscuit," Mira said, because she was 6, and because naming things made them less scary, and because she needed someone to talk to, or she was going to start crying again, and never stop. Biscuit did not seem to mind the name. Far above them, past the glowing canopy and the atmosphere, and the cold vacuum of space, a monitoring station picked up the pod's distress signal, and a 4-armed Solani analyst named Tarek V's pulled up the planetary file for Verith 4, and read the first line of the survey summary. It said, "Class 7 Death. World. No successful surface operations recorded. All previous survey teams lost within 72 hours. Planetary interdiction recommended." Tarek read it again to make sure he had not made a mistake. Then he sent an emergency transmission to the nearest Union rescue frigate, the Gentle Mercy. And in the message he wrote, "There is a human child on the surface of Verith 4, and if we do not get there soon, there will not be a child to rescue." He did not know that down on the surface, in the purple glow of an alien jungle, on a planet that had killed everything the galaxy had ever sent to it, a little girl was already falling asleep with her head resting on the warm fur of a creature that weighed less than 15 kilograms, and had absolutely no intention of letting anything touch her. Biscuit sat in the dark, with his eyes open and his ears turning like tiny radar dishes, listening to every sound the jungle made, and when something large moved through the undergrowth, 50 meters away, he pulled his lips back from his teeth and growled a growl that was far too deep and far too dangerous for an animal his size. The jungle moved on, the girl slept, and the honey badger kept watch. The sun on Verith 4 did not set the way suns set on Earth, or on any of the colony worlds Mira had seen in her short life. It just faded, like someone slowly turning down a lamp. And as the sky darkened, the jungle came alive in ways that made the daytime seem quiet and gentle by comparison. Everything glowed brighter in the dark, the trees pulsing with veins of blue and violet light, the moss on the ground shimmering like a carpet of tiny stars, and things moved in the canopy above that Mira could only see as shadows passing between the glowing branches. Big shadows, fast shadows, shadows with too many legs. Mira had crawled into a hollow space beneath a fallen tree that was covered in shelf-like fungus that gave off a soft orange light, and she had pulled her emergency blanket from the pod around her shoulders, and Biscuit was sitting at the entrance of the hollow, with his back to her, and his body very still. She was hungry and thirsty and scared, and her left arm had a bruise from the crash that was turning purple and yellow, and she wanted her mother so badly that it felt like a physical weight sitting on her chest. But she did not cry, because Biscuit was right there, and somehow that made it easier to be brave. The first sound came about an hour after full dark. It was a deep pulsing hum, like the bass note of a giant speaker, and it came from somewhere in the jungle to the east, and it made the air itself vibrate in a way that Mira could feel in her fillings and in the bones of her skull. Biscuit's fur stood up along his spine. The humming got closer, and Mira pressed herself deeper into the hollow and tried to make herself as small as possible. and through the gap beside Biscuit's body, she saw something emerge from between the glowing trees that made her forget how to breathe. It was the size of a bear, maybe bigger, and it moved on 6 legs that bent the wrong way, and its head was wide and flat, like a hammer with 2 rows of eyes that glowed a sickly green, and its jaw hung open to show teeth that crackled with tiny arcs of blue electricity, and the humming sound was coming from its throat. This was a dreadmaw, though Mira did not know that name. She only knew that it was the worst thing she had ever seen, and it was walking toward her hiding place with a slow confidence that said it already knew she was there. Biscuit made a sound. It was not a bark, or a growl, or a hiss. It was something in between all 3, a sound that said, in every language that has ever existed on any world, "Come closer, and I will make you regret it." The dreadmaw paused and tilted its massive head and looked down at this tiny creature blocking the entrance to its meal, and it seemed almost confused, like a wolf finding a hamster standing in its path and refusing to move. Then it fired its bioelectric pulse. The air between the dreadmaw and Biscuit turned white-blue for half a second. Biscuit's body seized up, and he was thrown backward into Mira's legs, and she screamed and grabbed him, and he was stiff as a board, and she thought he was dead. He was not dead. 3 seconds later, Biscuit was on his feet again, shaking his head like he had been splashed with cold water. And before Mira could grab him, he launched himself at the dreadmaw's face with a speed that did not seem possible for an animal built like a hairy brick. He hit the dreadmaw right between its rows of eyes, and its claws found the soft tissue around the sensory pits, and he dug in with everything he had. And the dreadmaw made a sound that was less a roar and more a shriek of pure surprise, because nothing on this planet had ever attacked it before. Nothing had ever been stupid enough or brave enough or angry enough to jump at its face. The dreadmaw thrashed and slammed its head against a tree trunk, trying to shake Biscuit off. But Honey Badger's skin is loose and thick, and Biscuit just twisted inside his own hide and kept biting. And when the dreadmaw finally flung him free, he hit the ground and rolled, and got right back up and charged again. Mira watched through her fingers as Biscuit fought something 40 times his weight with a fury that she did not have words for. And she understood in that moment something that scientists and philosophers and soldiers across the galaxy had debated for centuries about Earth creatures. Size did not matter when one side simply refused to lose. The dreadmaw retreated, bleeding from its sensory pits, its electrical crackle dimmed and uneven, and it disappeared into the jungle, making a low, wounded sound that Mira would later learn was the dreadmaw distress call. It called others. 2 more came within the hour, drawn by the sound, and Biscuit fought them both, one after the other, taking hits that sent his body skidding across the mossy ground, getting clawed and bitten and shocked, and every single time, getting back up with that same terrible sound in his throat. By the time the sky began to lighten again, the entrance to the hollow was streaked with dark blood, most of it belonging to dreadmaws, some of it belonging to Biscuit, and Mira was curled up in the back of the hollow, with her eyes wide open, because she had not slept at all. Biscuit came back to her, and collapsed against her chest, and she could feel his heart hammering fast, and his breathing was rough, and he had cuts on his face, and a bite mark on his shoulder that looked deep and awful. She tore a strip from her blanket and wrapped it around his shoulder, the way she had seen her mother wrap a bandage around her father's hand once, when he cut it cooking dinner. And Biscuit let her do it without growling or pulling away. "You are very brave," she told him quietly. "You are the bravest thing in the whole entire universe." Far above them in orbit, the rescue frigate Gentle Mercy had arrived. Commander Suleth stood on the bridge looking at the planet below with her compound eyes and her mandibles clicking in the way that meant she was thinking hard about something she did not like. "The planet is interdicted," she said to Tarek V's, who was standing beside her with a data tablet clutched in 2 of his 4 hands. 3 previous rescue operations have resulted in total crew loss. I cannot authorize a landing. There is a child down there, Tarek said. There was a child down there, Suleth corrected. Verath 4 does not allow survival past the first night. This is documented fact. Tarek wanted to argue, but he did not have evidence. He only had hope, and hope was not something that Fixian commanders accepted in place of data. So he went back to his station, and he pulled up the old survey satellite that was still in orbit around Verath 4, and he retasked its thermal sensors to scan the surface near the crash site, and what he found made him sit very still for a very long time. 2 heat signatures, one large, one very small, both alive, both moving. He printed the data and walked back to the bridge and placed it in front of Commander Suleth without saying a word, and she looked at it, and her compound eyes shifted in a way that Tarek had never seen before. That is not possible, she said. And yet, Tarek said quietly. Suleth looked at the data again, and then looked at the planet glowing below them, and for the first time in the conversation, her mandibles stopped clicking. What is down there with that child? She asked. Tarek did not have an answer yet, but he was going to find one. By the 3rd day, Mira had stopped crying. This was not because she was no longer scared, or because she did not miss her parents. She missed them so much it felt like a hole in her middle that food could not fill. But she had realized, somewhere between the second Dreadmaw attack and the moment she ate her first alien grub, that crying used energy, and energy was something she could not waste. Her mother had told her something once, back when they were packing for the colony ship. Something that Mira had not really understood at the time, but that now played in her head on repeat, like a song she could not forget. Humans are persistent creatures, baby. That means we do not stop. Other animals are faster and stronger, but we just keep going and going and going, until the thing that was chasing us gets tired and quits. That is our superpower. We do not quit. So Mira did not quit. She started walking on the morning of the 3rd day, heading uphill, because the emergency training video on the ship had said that higher ground was better for rescue signals, and she carried the broken beacon in her backpack, and Biscuit walked beside her like a small furry bodyguard who had never heard of the concept of fear. The jungle of Verath 4 was beautiful, in a way that was also terrifying. Every surface covered in life that pulsed and glowed and reached for her as she passed. Vines that moved on their own trying to wrap around her ankles. Flowers that snapped shut when her shadow fell on them. Fungi that released clouds of spores that made her sneeze, but that her gene therapy-enhanced immune system destroyed before they could take root in her lungs. A normal human from 300 years ago would have been dead from the air alone within the first hour. But Mira was a colony kid, born to parents who had received the standard genetic upgrades that all deep space settlers carried. An immune system that adapted fast and hit hard, dense enough to handle variable gravity, and a metabolism that could pull nutrition from almost anything organic. So when Biscuit dug up a nest of fat white grubs from under a rock and ate 3 of them, Mira watched him for a few minutes to make sure he did not get sick, and then she ate one herself. It tasted like raw mushroom mixed with something sour, and she gagged, but she chewed and she swallowed because her body needed fuel, and there was no one coming to bring her a sandwich. She ate another one for lunch. On the 3rd afternoon, something changed in the jungle around them, and it took Mira a while to understand what it was. The sounds were different. For the first 2 days, the jungle had been a wall of noise, clicking and buzzing, and the distant roars of things she did not want to see. But now, as she and Biscuit moved through the undergrowth, there was a bubble of quiet around them, a zone where the clicking stopped, and the buzzing faded, and the things in the canopy above went silent. The jungle was avoiding them. Biscuit had spent 3 days fighting everything that came close, every snake that dropped from the branches, every pack of small razor-tooth hunters that tried to circle them in the night, every lumbering armored thing that wandered too near, and he had fought them all, with the same absolute commitment to violence that he had shown the first Dreadmaw. He could not kill most of them. He was too small for that. But he did not need to kill them. He only needed to make the fight cost more than the meal was worth, and Biscuit was very, very good at making things expensive. The creatures of Verath 4 were smart, smarter than Earth animals by a wide margin. Smart enough to learn from pain. Smart enough to communicate danger to others through chemical signals left on trees and rocks. And the message that was spreading through the jungle was simple and clear. The small, angry thing and the tall, soft thing are not food. They are a headache wrapped in teeth and fury. Go around them. There is easier prey elsewhere. Mira noticed it first when a pack of razor stalkers appeared on a ridge above them, 6 of them with their glowing eyes locked on her. And Biscuit rose up on his hind legs and let out that deep rattling hiss of his, and the lead razor stalker looked at him for a long moment, and then turned and led the pack away without a sound. "Good boy, Biscuit," Mira said, and she gave him a grub from her pocket. On the frigate above, Tarek Vise had not slept in 2 days. He had been watching the satellite thermal data obsessively, tracking the 2 heat signatures as they moved slowly but steadily uphill. And he had noticed something that made his scales itch in the way they did when something important was happening. The predator signatures were moving away from the child, not just the ones nearby, but across a widening radius, the thermal blooms of large. Predators were rerouting their patrol paths to avoid the area where Mira and her companion were traveling. And this was not normal behavior for Verath 4 fauna. These were apex hunters that had never had a reason to avoid anything. Tarek pulled up the ship's xenobiology database and searched for the cargo manifest of the Cradle of Dawn, and found the entry for the specimen that had been in the lab. Mellivora capensis, common name, honey badger, origin planet Earth, and he opened the behavioral file. He read it once quickly, and then he read it again slowly, and then he read it a 3rd time out loud to himself, because he needed to hear the words to make sure they were real. The file described an animal that attacked venomous snakes for fun, that stole food from lions, that had been documented surviving bites from cobras and mambas by falling unconscious from the venom, and then simply waking up and going about its day, that had skin so thick and loose that predators could not get a grip on it. That had been known to chase animals 50 times its size out of sheer spite. There was a note at the bottom from the human researcher who had compiled the file, and it read, "Honey badger does not care about your size, or your claws, or your venom, or your teeth. Honey badger will fight you, and it will keep fighting you until you leave or it dies, and even dying is not a guarantee it will stop." Tarek closed the file and sat still for a moment, and then he stood up and walked to the bridge, where Commander Suleth was reviewing supply manifests. "Commander," he said, "I know what is with the child." "What is it?" Suleth asked without looking up. "It is a small Earth predator called a honey badger." "How small?" "Approximately 12 to 14 kilograms. Suleth looked up now, and her compound eyes focused on him with the sharp intensity that meant she thought he was wasting her time. "You are telling me that a 14-kilogram animal is keeping a human child alive on a Class 7 death world?" "Yes, Commander. That is absurd." "I have the thermal data," Tarek said. "The apex predators of Verath 4 are actively avoiding this animal. They are changing their hunting routes to go around it. In 3 days nothing has successfully attacked the child, and the reason is this creature." Suleth was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Show me the file on this animal." Tarek handed her the data tablet, and she read the behavioral summary, and when she finished, she set the tablet down very carefully, as if it might bite her. "The humans keep these as pets?" she asked. "Some of them, yes. The humans who already live on a Class 4 death world keep an animal that fights venomous snakes for recreation, and does not stay dead when envenomated, as a pet." "That is correct, Commander." Suleth's mandibles clicked rapidly, which was the Thixian equivalent of a human saying, "A very bad word," and she turned to her navigation officer and said, "Begin plotting a descent trajectory to the surface of Verath 4. Tarek blinked all four of his eyes at once. "You are authorizing a rescue." "I am authorizing a rescue," Sulef said, "because if that animal can survive down there, then I need to understand how. And because there is a child who deserves to go home. And because, frankly, Tarek, if the humans ever find out we left one of their young on a death world when we had the means to retrieve her, they will come to my homeworld and they will bring more of these honey badgers, and I do not want that." Tarek did not argue. He simply went back to his station and began calculating the safest landing zone near the child's projected path. And for the first time in 3 days, he allowed himself to feel something that the Selani did not have a proper word for, but that humans called hope. Mira reached the highland ridge on the morning of the 5th day, and she stood at the edge of the tree line looking out over a plateau of low, scrubby growth and flat rock, and she felt something she had not felt since the crash. Open sky above her. The canopy had been so thick in the jungle below that she had almost forgotten what it looked like to see the sky without leaves and branches in the way, and she stood there for a minute, just breathing and looking up at the pale green sky of Verath 4 with its 2 small moons still visible in the daylight. Biscuit did not care about the sky. He was sniffing the ground, and his fur was bristled, and he kept making small huffing sounds that Mira had learned meant he was nervous. But Biscuit was always nervous when they entered new territory, so she did not think much of it. She sat down on a flat rock and opened her backpack and took out the emergency beacon, which she had been carrying since the crash. Worked, because the main transmitter was cracked and the power cell was almost dead. But Mira was her father's daughter, and her father was an engineer who talked about circuits the way other people talked about cooking. And Mira had listened, even when she pretended not to, and she had spent the last 2 days collecting things from the jungle as she walked. She had found fungal fibers that conducted electricity. She had discovered this by accident when she touched one and got a small shock that made her hand tingle. And she had pulled long strands of it and wrapped them carefully in a piece of her blanket. And she had also found a small power cell in the emergency kit in her backpack that still had some charge. Now she sat on the rock with the beacon in her lap, and she pulled the cracked casing apart, and she looked at the broken transmitter inside, and she thought about what her father would do. He would say, "Mira, every broken thing is just a puzzle that wants to be solved. You find what is missing, and you fill the gap." So she filled the gap. She used the fungal fibers to bridge the crack in the transmitter, wrapping them tight and pressing them into place with a paste made from crushed, luminescent moss that hardened when it dried. And she connected the small power cell to the main battery housing with a twist of wire from her backpack strap. It was ugly and messy, and no engineer in the galaxy would have called it proper work. But when she pressed the activation button, the beacon made a sound it had not made before, a high, thin whine that climbed in pitch and then settled into a steady pulse. The light on top blinked red, then green, then red again. Mira did not know if it was transmitting, but it was doing something, and that was more than it had done for 5 days. So she set it on the highest rock she could find, and wedged it in place with smaller stones. Then she ate some grubs and gave some to Biscuit. Lay down in the shade of a boulder to sleep, because she was so tired that her bones felt heavy, and her eyes would not stay open, no matter how hard she tried. Biscuit curled up against her chest the way he always did, and Mira put her arm around him and felt his warm, rough fur against her skin, and she was asleep in seconds. She did not know what lived on the plateau. The grave crown had no proper name in any language, because no scientist had ever survived long enough to name it, and the survey drones that had photographed it from the air had simply tagged it as Apex Terrestrial Predator, Do Not Approach, before their signals were lost. It was ancient, possibly centuries old, a reptilian creature the size of a small shuttle, with armor plates covering its body, like overlapping shields of dark brown chitin. and along its spine and tail there were rows of hollow spines that dripped with a neurotoxin so powerful that a single drop could paralyze a dreadmaw in under 4 seconds. It was smart, not sapient, but close. Smart enough to ambush rather than chase. Smart enough to wait for the right moment. Smart enough to know that the 2 small warm things that had arrived on its plateau were not a threat. They were food. It had been watching them since they cleared the tree line. It watched the small one sit on the rock and do something with her hands that it did not understand, and it watched the even smaller one pace and sniff and bristle. And it waited, because waiting was what it did best. It had once waited 6 days without moving for a herd of grazing creatures to pass close enough to strike. When the small one lay down and stopped moving, the grave crown began its approach. It moved with a silence that should not have been possible for something its size. Each massive leg placed with care on the flat rock, its body low to the ground, its spines folded flat against its back to reduce its profile. Locked on the sleeping child with the fixed focus of a predator that has already decided the hunt is over. It got within 10 meters, then 5. Then it gathered its hind legs beneath it and lunged. Biscuit woke up. There is a moment in the life of every creature when the body makes a decision faster than the brain can process. And for Biscuit, that moment was now. And what his body decided was not to run or hide or freeze, but to do what honey badgers have always done, since the first one crawled out of an African burrow millions of years ago. He attacked. He launched himself off Mira's chest and hit the grave crown in the face as it came down, and his claws raked across the smooth surface between its 4 eyes, and his teeth sank into the soft tissue at the edge of its jaw, where the armor plates did not quite meet. The grave crown had never been attacked by its prey before. Nothing on Verith 4 attacked the grave crown, and the shock of this tiny surprise was overwhelming. Screaming thing, latching onto its face, caused it to abort its lunge and rear back, and its massive head swung sideways, and Biscuit was flung off and hit the rock and rolled. Mira woke up screaming. She saw the grave crown, and she saw Biscuit, and she understood in one terrible second what was happening. And she grabbed the nearest rock and threw it as hard as she could, and it bounced off the creature's armor without leaving a mark. But it did not matter, because Biscuit was already on his feet again. He charged. The grave crown opened its mouth, and Biscuit went straight in, past the teeth, clawing at the tongue and the soft palate, and the grave crown made a sound like a broken engine, and shook its head violently, and spat Biscuit out in a spray of blood and saliva. Biscuit hit the ground, and his legs were shaking, and there were 2 neurotoxin spines embedded in his side, the poison already working its way into his bloodstream, and his back legs gave out, fell. Mira screamed his name. The grave crown came forward again, slower now, more cautious, and it looked at the tiny creature on the ground, and it waited for it to stop moving, the way all poison things stopped moving on this planet. Biscuit did not stop moving. His legs twitched, and then they worked again, and he stood up, unsteady and bleeding, and full of enough poison to kill a creature 10 times his size. And he faced the grave crown, and he hissed. The grave crown struck with its tail, and the spine tip caught Biscuit across the back, and opened a gash that showed the muscle underneath. And Biscuit staggered, but did not fall. He bit the tail. The grave crown pulled its tail free, and struck again, and Biscuit was knocked sideways, and got up and charged again, and was knocked down and got up and charged again. This went on for 11 minutes. The survey satellite recorded every second of it, and this footage would later be shown in lecture halls and military academies and xenobiology conferences across the galaxy, and every single time someone watched it, they had the same reaction, which was to sit very still and say nothing for a while. Because what the footage showed was not a fight. A fight implies that both sides have a chance of winning. What it showed was something that did not have a word in most galactic languages, but that humans have always understood in their bones. It showed something that would not give up. The Grave Crown could not make this small thing stop. Every strike that should have been fatal was answered with another charge. Every dose of venom that should have ended the fight was processed and shrugged off and ignored. And the Grave Crown's ancient brain, which had never encountered this situation before, began sending a signal that it did not recognize. It was afraid. The Grave Crown turned and walked away from its own territory, and it did not look back, and it did not return. Ran to Biscuit and found him lying on his side, breathing in short, quick gasps, his fur matted with blood and venom, his body covered in wounds that should have killed any animal on any planet in the known galaxy. She picked him up as gently as she could and held him against her chest, and she was crying so hard she could barely see. "Please do not die," she whispered. "Please, Biscuit, you cannot die. You are my friend, and I need you. Please, please, please." Biscuit opened one eye. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that flat, calm expression that said nothing and everything at the same time. He licked her hand. Then he closed his eye and went to sleep. And behind them, on the highest rock on the plateau, the emergency beacon blinked green once and then twice, and then held steady as its signal punched through the atmosphere and reached the sensor array of the rescue frigate Gentle Mercy, which was already descending through the upper atmosphere of Verath 4. Tarek V saw the signal appear on his screen, and he stood up so fast his chair fell over, and he shouted, "I have her! I have a beacon signal! She is alive!" And the bridge crew turned to look at him, and Commander Suleth clicked her mandibles once and said, "Get me a landing team, full combat gear. Tell them what is down there. Tell them all of it." The shuttle launched 12 minutes later. Mira sat on the plateau, holding her friend and waiting for someone to come, and not knowing if anyone would, and hoping with everything she had that the blinking green light meant what she thought it meant. The jungle below the ridge was quiet. Nothing came near the plateau. Nothing dared. The rescue shuttle came down through the green sky of Verath 4, like a metal bird screaming against the atmosphere, its engines burning hard to slow the descent. And 6 armed soldiers sat in the cargo bay, wearing full combat armor and carrying weapons designed to stop creatures twice the size of anything they expected to face. They were scared. Commander Suleth had told them exactly what was on this planet, and she had not softened any of the details, and every single one of them had volunteered anyway, because there was a child down there, and soldiers from any species in the galaxy will do hard things when a child is in danger. Tarek Vias was on the shuttle too, even though he was an analyst and not a soldier. Even though his hands were shaking so badly, he had to sit on 2 of them to keep them still, because he had been the one who found her signal, and he was not going to let someone else be the first face she saw. The shuttle landed on the plateau with a hiss of hydraulics and a blast of heated air that flattened the scrubby vegetation in a wide circle. And the rear hatch opened, and Tarek was down the ramp before the soldiers had unbuckled their harnesses. He saw her immediately. She was sitting cross-legged in a patch of crushed vegetation near a tall rock, and in her lap there was a small animal wrapped in strips of emergency blanket that were stained dark with blood. And she was stroking its fur with one hand, and holding the blinking beacon in the other, as if she was afraid to let go of either one. Tarek walked toward her slowly with his 4 hands open and visible, because he did not want to frighten her. And when he got close enough to see her face, he dropped to his knees. She was thin and dirty and sunburned, and her hair was matted with things he did not want to identify. And there were scratches and bruises on every visible inch of her skin. But her eyes were clear and steady, and she looked at him with an expression that was not afraid. "You survived," Tarek said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "Biscuit kept us safe," Mira said, like this was the most obvious thing in the world, like it explained everything. And in a way, it did. The soldiers fanned out across the plateau in a defensive perimeter, but there was nothing to defend against. The jungle was silent, the plateau was empty. Even the insects that usually swarmed any warm body on Vareth 4 were keeping their distance, as if word had spread even to the smallest creatures that this particular spot was not a place to go. The medic reached Mira first and knelt beside her and began scanning with a diagnostic tool, and what the scanner showed made her pause and run it again. Mira had 17 distinct injuries, including 4 infected cuts, 2 parasitic organisms that her immune system was actively destroying, moderate malnutrition, early-stage dehydration, and a hairline fracture in her left wrist that she had apparently not mentioned to anyone, because she had been using that hand to carry things for 3 days. Her immune system had adapted to the alien biome of Vareth 4 in 5 days, producing antibodies and immune responses that should have required months of pharmaceutical support to develop. And the medic shook her head and muttered something about human biology being unfair. Then she looked at Biscuit, and the scan results made her call over the veterinary specialist. The honey badger had 17 distinct wounds, which was the same number as Mira, and the medic would later note this coincidence in her report, as if the universe had a sense of symmetry. But that was where the similarity ended. Biscuit had 4 different types of alien venom in his bloodstream: 2 cracked ribs, a torn left ear, a dislocated shoulder that appeared to have popped itself back into place through sheer muscular force, deep puncture wounds from neurotoxin spines, claw marks across his back, that exposed muscle, bite marks on all 4 legs, and chemical burns on his nose from a plant he had apparently headbutted at some point during the 5 days. The veterinary specialist ran the scan 3 times and then called the medic over and said, "This animal should be dead 7 times over by my count, and I want you to confirm these readings because I think my equipment is broken." The equipment was not broken. Biscuit was simply operating outside every parameter the Galactic Union had ever established for what a subsapient organism could survive. And when the vet tried to administer a painkiller, Biscuit woke up and bit the injection tool in half, and then went back to sleep in Mira's lap. "He does not like needles," Mira explained helpfully. They carried Mira onto the shuttle still holding Biscuit, because when the medic tried to separate them for treatment, Mira's grip tightened, and her jaw set in a way that the medic recognized from her training manual. Under the section titled, "Human Children Under Stress Do Not Force Compliance," and so they let her keep him. The shuttle lifted off Vareth 4, and Mira watched the glowing jungle shrink below them through the viewport window, and she did not say goodbye to it, because she did not feel sentimental about a place that had tried to kill her every single day. She just held Biscuit and watched it disappear. On the frigate, Commander Suleth was waiting at the hangar bay, and when Mira walked off the shuttle on her own 2 feet, limping but upright, carrying a battle-scarred honey badger in her arms, the Thixian commanders stood at attention. This was a sign of respect that Thixians only showed to warriors who had survived something extraordinary, and Suleth had never in her long career shown it to a member of another species, let alone a child. Mira walked past her and said, "Do you have any food? I am very hungry, and Biscuit likes grubs, but I think he would also eat meat if you have some." The aftermath of Mira's rescue spread across the galaxy faster than any official report could contain it. The satellite footage was classified for approximately 3 hours before someone on Tarek's team leaked it to a xenobiology forum, and within a day it had been viewed by 11 billion sentient beings across 400 worlds. The footage of Biscuit fighting the Grave Crown became the most watched video in Galactic Union history. Commander Suleth filed a formal request to reclassify Earth from Deathworld Class 4 to Deathworld Class 12, and in her report she wrote, "The reclassification is not based on the planet's megafauna or geological instability, but on the fact that even the small non-sapient companion animals of this world display a lethality to mass ratio and psychological resilience that exceeds the apex predators of most registered death worlds. The humans do not merely survive their home planet, they have domesticated its nightmares. And they call them pets. The Galactic Union Xenobiology Council held an emergency session to discuss the implications of what they called Terran-fauna symbiosis. And the presentation included the satellite footage, and during the 11-minute segment showing the Grave Crown fight, 3 delegates from herbivore-descended species formally requested breaks, and 2 of them fainted and had to be carried from the chamber. A new entry was added to the Galactic Union Guide to Human-Adjacent Species under the heading Mellivora capensis. It read, "Threat level extreme, temperament hostile when provoked, with a provocation threshold of effectively 0. Recommended interaction protocol, do not approach, and do not threaten, and do not make eye contact. If encountered near a human child, leave the system immediately." The Human Liaison Office added a note at the bottom that said, "They are actually kind of cute when they are sleeping." Mira was reunited with her parents. Aboard the Cradle of Dawn's sister ship, 3 days later. Her father saw her walking down the corridor toward him, and he fell to his knees, and could not speak, and could not stop crying, and her mother ran to her, and picked her up, and held her so tight that Mira said, "Mom, you are squishing Biscuit," because she was still carrying him. Her mother looked down at the scarred, battered animal in her daughter's arms, the creature that had stood between her child and the worst things a death world could offer. The 12-kilogram bundle of fury and loyalty that had fought and bled and refused to die for 5 days straight, so that a 6-year-old girl could live. She knelt down and put her hand on Biscuit's head, very gently, and whispered, "Thank you." Biscuit sniffed her hand, and then ate a grub that Mira had been keeping in her pocket, and fell asleep. 1 year later, Mira stood in front of her class at the Union Intercultural School on Station Harmony, and gave a presentation for Cultural Exchange Week. The topic was, "My Best Friend." She showed a holographic image captured by the survey satellite, a small girl in a torn emergency blanket, standing on a plateau with a tiny animal at her feet, and behind them, the retreating shape of the largest predator on a Class 7 death world. And every alien child in the room stared at the image with the wide-eyed silence of young minds encountering something they did not have a framework to understand. Interaction Guidelines. And under the section labeled Human Pets, she added a single new line in bold text. It said, "Do not touch." That evening, Mira went home to her family's quarters on the station, and she sat on the couch with her mother on one side and her father on the other, and Biscuit asleep on her lap. And her father asked her if she wanted to talk about what happened on Vareth 4. "Not right now," she said. "Maybe later." "Whenever you are ready," her mother said. Mira looked down at Biscuit, at the scars on his face and the torn ear, and the fur that had grown back white over the worst of his wounds, and she scratched behind his good ear the way he liked, and he made a small sound in his sleep that was almost like purring, but rougher. "Dad," she said. "Yes, baby. Can we keep him forever?" Her father looked at the honey badger, the animal that had fought a death world to a standstill for his daughter. Xenobiologist in the galaxy was now terrified of the 12-kilogram wrecking ball of teeth and claws and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat that had brought his little girl home alive. "Yes," he said, "we can keep him forever." Biscuit slept. He did not dream of jungles or monsters or the things he had fought in the dark. He dreamed of grubs, and that was enough.